speaks to their strength and why that strength was and is necessary. So any additional measures would complement the fact that we announced yesterday that now all 10 of Russia's largest bank, which hold 80% of the assets in Russia's banking sector, are now subject to these measures. The export controls that we have the Department of Commerce, to be specific, imposed yesterday now block the import of some 50% of the strategic imports that Moscow would need for its strategic positioning, its strategic ambitions. The fact that the Russian government is now cut off in terms of its sovereign debt from Western financing. The fact that elites around President Putin are now sanctioned and subject to those attendant restrictions. Any additional measures, and again, we have said that if President Putin continues to escalate, we will do the same, but any additional measures would join that long litany of steps that already constitute the strongest, the most decisive response that the United States, and together with our allies and partners, have ever mounted.
So I have a couple of follow-ups on both of those issues, but before, please indulge me. Foreign Policy magazine first reported this about locally employed staff working in Ukraine and how they're seeking U.S. help. So what is the plan for them? How many people are we talking about? And what is your assessment? Do you not think you have an obligation to these people?
Humaira, the Secretary and others from here have been in regular touch with the Embassy Kiev community, and that, of course, includes our locally employed staff. You've traveled with us. You know the value that the Secretary, that the team around him attach to our locally employed staff. They are at the heart of our embassy operations around the world. Quite simply, our embassies, our posts around the world could not function without our locally employed staff. On February 24th, a couple days ago, the locally employed staff committee sent us an email following Russia's unprovoked attack against Kiev. We are exploring all legal options available to us that would enable us to support them at what clearly is a very difficult time for our locally employed staff. We've already taken some important steps. We've implemented paid administrative leave for all staff unable to work or telework, regardless of their location. Whether our local staff are working, whether they're teleworking, whether they are unable to work, let me be clear, they are being paid. Whether they are in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, they are being paid. We have established a dedicated communications channel for all of our locally employed staff to contact us with their questions, with their concerns, so that we can be responsive directly to them. And we provided the option of salary advances to support those locally employed staff who need an extra amount of assistance at what is clearly a very difficult time. So these relationships are deeply meaningful to us. They're deeply important to us. Again, our operations could not continue without our locally employed staff.
How many people are we talking about?
Now, I'm not in a position to offer that. All of them are being paid. All of them have these options available to them.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, we're just going to move.
Can I just do one quick question on that? Okay. One thing that they asked for specifically in this letter was assistance relocating out of the country. The Biden administration has been talking about this potential assault for weeks, now. So why isn't there already a way to help these local employed staff get out of the country if they want to, and do you plan on doing that?
Well, we are exploring all options that are legally available to us and that are logistically available to us at this time. As you know, we have, for over the course of weeks now, been issuing public communications directed in the first instance at the American citizen community in Kiev, those who otherwise would have traveled to Ukraine, urging individuals not to travel to Ukraine, and more recently urging Americans located in Ukraine to depart Ukraine. We have, of course, provided guidance to our locally engaged staff, locally employed staff, who had come to us, seeking guidance, seeking direction. So I can't speak to specific cases. I can't speak to specific decisions or choices that may have been made, but we are here to support them in every conceivable way that we can.
Is there any reason to believe they'd be specifically subject to Russian aggression?
I'm sorry?
Is there any reason to believe that these locally employed staff would be specifically subject to Russian aggressions?
I have not seen any indication that they would be targeted for their role, but we have seen every indication that this is intended to be on the part of the Russian Federation, not only an assault on Ukraine's territorial integrity, not only an assault on its government, but also an assault on the Ukrainian people. So we are deeply concerned about the intentions, the motivations of the Russian Federation. It's why we are seeking to bring this unprovoked, needless war to an end as quickly as we can.
Just on this, do you know, were there any local staff who accompanied the people who went to Lviv and were working in Lviv and who have since now been relocated basically to Poland, and who would have gone and are now temporarily at least living in Poland?
It was a core embassy team, Matt. That
just Americans, or were there local staff too?
It was a core embassy team. I'm not in a position to offer if there were any locally employed staff with them.
Just to close the loop on sanctions, and then I'll move on to UN very briefly. So the assessments out there about how long it would take Russian forces to overrun Kiev is mentioned like in days, and yet the president and others in this government said yesterday sanctions would be more impactful in time. Is it fair to say then, in the immediate term, U.S. is basically unable to stop Putin?
I don't think you heard anyone say that. What you have heard us say is that Well, let me back up. Over the course of months now, we have been ringing the alarm bell as we had information available to us as early as late last year that Vladimir Putin had these intentions. We started to see his forces mobilize around that time. You remember in November of 2021 when we first started to speak about this publicly. We, beyond our public messaging, we engaged in robust private diplomacy behind closed doors to ensure that our allies and partners around the world knew what we knew so that we could operate in tandem with one another. When it comes to the sanctions that you mentioned, these were coordinated with allies and partners around the world. Part of what gives them the bite, the heft that they have, is that these were not just measures that were introduced by the United States, but also by the European Union.
It doesn't matter how many people, how many countries introduce that. It's a matter of time, and we're talking about days. And President openly said that they don't have the days.
But you will look if you see what has transpired in the Russian marketplace over the course not only of recent days but of recent weeks. The threat of these massive consequences have pushed the ruble to its lowest levels in years, pushed the Russian stock market, pushed down investor sentiment, and have made clear that these measures have tremendous bite. And we saw that yesterday when these measures were introduced. So what is true is that these measures are designed to garner strength, to garner momentum over time. But with their immediate introduction yesterday, on top of the measures that we imposed on Monday in response to President Putin's recognition of these so-called republics in eastern Ukraine, you have seen that there has been an immediate effect. There has been an immediate bite.
My final one is on UN. The vote is delayed for an hour. Do you know why?
I do not. You would need to
Are you
ask
confident you've got UAE and India to vote yes?
We are confident that the Russian Federation will be and will be shown to be isolated on the world stage. We are confident that our partners, that our allies around the world will stand in very clear, very stark opposition to this aggression, to this assault on Ukraine's territorial integrity, to its independence, to its sovereignty. We have every expectation that message will emanate loud and clear from this UN session.
All your partners, including India and UAE.
We have every expectation that message will be loud and clear to the Russian Federation, unambiguous to President Putin. Yes.
Something that you said when you were speaking with Matt. You said if you were to listen to the blunder of President Putin, you might believe he was willing to go beyond Ukraine. Do you have reason to believe that that is the case?
President Putin knows because we have stated very clearly that our commitment to NATO's Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is as vibrant, is as sacrosanct as it was at NATO's founding some 7 decades ago. You heard the president say again yesterday that we will fight for every inch of NATO territory. That is a message that we have made very clear in public. It is a message that we have conveyed very clearly in private. I have no doubt that that message has reached President Putin.
And one separate question. I want to do a follow-up.
Is there anything specific to indicate? The NATO Secretary General said today that there are indications that the Kremlin's objectives span beyond Ukraine. Is there anything to suggest from the U.S.'s perspective that they do?
Well, what we have seen from President Putin, not only in recent days, but in recent years, is his desire to go back to an era that has long since passed, an era in which spheres of influence are acceptable, an era in which large countries can bully small countries, an era in which might equals right. That is an era that should have ended. Certainly with the fall of the Berlin Wall, certainly with the end of the Cold War. But of course, President Putin has other desires, other aspirations. It is our task to reinforce the rules that have, again, governed the international community over the course of some 70 years, but certainly in more recent years since the end of the Cold War. Abigail.
Can you give us any update on your efforts to help Americans who are still in Ukraine? I know you are always hesitant to give exact numbers, but do you have any further indication of how many Americans have crossed over the border in Poland, for instance?
So as you've heard us say, we don't have precise figures in any country around the world of the number of Americans who are present in a foreign country at any given time. And you know those reasons well. We don't track Americans. We don't require them to register. We don't require them to unregister when they leave a country. In the case of Ukraine, however, we did have an estimate, and we do have an estimate, dated from October of last year of Americans resident in Ukraine. At the time, October of 2021, there were 6,600 Americans resident in Ukraine by our estimation. And that estimation was based on data from our Ukrainian partners. It was based on data that was available to us as well, including data from local organizations. That same month, October of 2021, is this very same month that we started warning Americans not to travel to Ukraine. It was those warnings were later superseded by clear and consistent encouragement to Americans to leave the country, and most recently, warnings that Americans should leave the country. So since October of 2021, we have seen...
You've been listening to State Department spokesperson Ned Price giving us an update on the Ukraine-Russia situation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. Thanks so much for streaming with us as our special coverage continues here on ABC News Live. A live look now at the Ukrainian capital of Kiev as Russian forces approach the city. Here's what we know right now. NATO activating its response force, the first time the alliance has ever activated the 40,000 troops for deterrence and defense. The push toward Kiev reportedly going slower than the Russians had expected, especially in the past 24 hours. The Pentagon saying there's been greater resistance by Ukrainians, and it appears the Russians have lost momentum. A senior defense official telling us only about a third of the 150,000 troops amassed on the border are actually fighting, and as of now, Russia has not committed the majority of its forces inside Ukraine. Thousands of Russian Navy infantry landing near the coastal city of Mariupol now, which could see heavy fighting. And President Biden speaking with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier today. Zelensky tweeting that they discussed strengthening sanctions, defense assistance, and an anti-war coalition. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson also announcing new sanctions against Putin and urging other NATO leaders to take further action to inflict maximum pain on the regime. All of this happening as Meta says Russia has restricted the use of Facebook after the company refused to stop fact-checking Russia media outlets. Joining us now with the very latest, ABC's Ian Pannell. He's in Ukraine's capital of Kiev. Also, ABC's Phil Lipoff is in Poland. Thank you both for just continuing our coverage with us. Ian, let's start with you. Russian troops continuing their assault on the country, zeroing in on Kiev. New satellite images actually showing Russia crossing from Belarus into Ukraine in an effort to fully take over the capital. What does it feel like to be there right now? Give us an update.
Yeah, Kira, I mean, I have to say the mood is bleaker, the situation more tense, the future looking more dark than at any point in this crisis so far. This really is a city bracing itself for the worst. We know that Russian forces were spotted inside Kyiv today. Defense forces have been activated in the city. We've seen troops running around. I've seen trucks loaded with ammunition driving around, people setting up defensive positions. The head of the armed forces essentially lifted almost all restrictions on anyone joining the army, including age restrictions. They've been handing out thousands of weapons to civilians for them also to defend their areas. We're hearing stories of people setting up defensive units in their neighborhoods. There is a real sense here that the worst is about to come. And given the tone of what we've been hearing from the Kremlin, there doesn't seem to be any appetite whatsoever to try and find a diplomatic way out of this. This is going to be a battle. It's going to be bloody. There are going to be a lot of casualties. And there are now tens of thousands of Ukrainians on the run.
And as you report that, and we hear these details from you, Ian, at the same time, it seems quite remarkable that the president of Ukraine actually posted a video just outside of his office there in Kyiv showing that leadership is still in the city and that they plan to fight. How has this impacted morale, and how unusual is it to put out a video like this?
Yeah, I mean, this is all about morale. This is all about stiffening resolve. President Zelensky clearly feels he has to lead from the front. Inevitably, there is going to be disinformation thrown around by the Russians about this. And, of course, the Ukrainians have to use propaganda to their advantage. But, yes, we identified that this was right outside his offices, together with the defense minister, the prime minister, the head of parliament, essentially saying, we are here. Now, Zelensky also today talking, saying, look, it's all very well you showing us support from abroad, but we're here on our own, and no one's coming to Ukraine's aid in terms of the fighting, and they are feeling the pressure. They know they face a far superior military, and yes, it's possible that we're going to see tens of thousands of people pick up weapons ready to defend themselves, but they are facing overwhelming odds. It is going to be a bitter and bloody and brutal battle, and it's going to be a very hard 24, 48 hours ahead. There was a moment today when perhaps it looked like there could be some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, but it didn't look serious. It didn't look like the Russians were serious, and President Zelensky is not ready to surrender, which is essentially what the Russians are saying. Vladimir Putin, again, talking about sort of proto-Nazi units in the country without offering any evidence whatsoever, but this is his alternate universe. This is his justification for this war, that this is defending the security and the safety of Russia and the Russian-speaking people. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. This is an act of aggression. As President Biden said, it's a war of choice, and it's a war that has no meaning. There's no real purpose here other than to crush Ukraine, expand Russian influence, trying to restore some warped sense of Russian military and geographic pride. But we've seen opposition inside Russia. We've seen Russian figures, sporting figures, voice their opposition to what's going on here. The peoples of Europe are speaking loudly against this. But the truth is, the people of Kiev are alone tonight, and many of them are sleeping in basements, sleeping in metro stations, and they're afraid, and they're quite rightly afraid of what is about to happen.
As we see the video right there that you and your photographer have been able to capture for us inside Ukraine there. Meanwhile, Phil, the UN refugee agency now estimated some 100,000 Ukrainians have already been forced from their homes. How are neighboring countries preparing to take on these refugees, and specifically where you are as well?
Well, quite frankly, Kira, the borders are open and the countries are willing to do this, but it is going to be a monumental task. You hear Ian describe the dark time that has fallen upon the capital city, Kyiv, in Ukraine, across the border, and yet people will be sleeping in basements tonight, those who stayed. Ian points out that tens of thousands and now hundreds of thousands are working their way toward the borders. Here in Poland, one aid worker told us that the country of Poland has opened up 123 reception centers. These are places to receive Ukrainians who come into this country. They will not be areas where people can camp out. They will be areas where the Ukrainians can come and then sort of transition into life here. Poland already has about 2 million Ukrainians living here. So some of these people crossing the border will have family and friends, but some will be coming into a country they don't know. But the borders are open in the countries surrounding Ukraine, and the wait, Kira, is anywhere from 10 to 20 hours depending on the border.
So, Phil, you've been in contact, I understand, with our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz, as she and her team just crossed into Slovakia, right? What have you heard on that?
We've been in contact with Martha and her producer, Sam, and I really feel like it's important to get this information out there because you can hear the words refugee crisis. We've heard them before, but what Martha and Sam just experienced is something that needs to be told to the world, and people really have to try to visualize it. Martha and Sam walked across the border, a rural border, into Slovakia. They chose that border because they thought it would be one of the easiest to cross. The wait to cross into Slovakia at that border is about 10 hours right now. They walked across it with women and children, Ukrainian women and children. The men 18 to 60 stood at the border. Think about this, Kira. They stood at the border and hugged and kissed their families goodbye and watched the women and children walk into unknown territory, uncertain territory in Slovakia. People were crying as they were hugging their families. They were so unprepared, Martha and Sam report, that they didn't have gloves on. This is bitter cold in this region, and these men 18 to 16, as Ian just pointed out, are being told they can't leave the country. They have to stay and fight. Most of these people aren't fighters. They're not in the military. And they just had to say goodbye to their wives and children as they watched them walk into Slovakia. That is the face of a refugee crisis that is only just beginning.
As we see those faces right now in the pictures that you capture for us, it's a story we will stay closely on, indeed, from Kiev to Poland. Phil and Ian, thank you both. And Phil, I'll take it back to you.
All right, Kira, thank you. I want to bring in Tom Bossert. The NATO alliance says that there was a price to pay here. And Tom is a national security analyst and former White House Homeland Security advisor. Tom, thanks for being with us. It's always good to discuss this with you. What do you make of NATO activating its response force for the first time in history? What exactly does that deterrence and defense mean in this particular role?
I think it's an incredibly wise move. I'd have recommended it. In fact, I'm not surprised by it at all. What we're seeing now is Putin in a completely unpredictable use of force right on all of their borders. So at this stage, it's only almost obvious that NATO activate this force. There's so much room for miscalculation here. In a lot of ways, Putin has let the genie out of the bottle. We can have Russian jets flying into other airspace, NATO airspace, Turkish airspace, Polish airspace, drawing fire and leading this thing into directions that we can't control. His military will take actions even without his permission if that happens, and it could spiral. So NATO has an obligation here to kind of circle the wagons.
Yeah, and Tom, we heard today from the Czech Republic that the Czech Republic and Poland restricting airspace to Russian carriers. The Russians do not have superiority over Ukraine. Ukrainian air defenses are still working. How significant is that for this fight against the Russians?
It's significant for, I guess, two reasons. One, it's a bit surprising that they haven't yet carried that out. It's usually the first step or one of the early steps in the Russian playbook, or really, I think, in any military playbook, or at least that's what most of the generals have been saying. We've seen this play out in the past. There's this acronym in Russian military planning called SOD-SIT, where they go after strategically damaging all of the enemy's critical infrastructure targets. It's pretty standard in their military planning playbook. So I suspect if they really want to, they will do it. I think it reveals, though, at least to me, that Putin does not have a clear military objective. At least it's not clear to any of the observers that I talk to. We don't know what he wants to achieve or whether he has the force adequate to achieve it and sustain it. If he really wants to take on maintaining control over Ukraine, given what we've seen in the defiant eyes of the Ukrainian people, he better have more forces ready to stay there longer. And I think he's got to decide whether he wants that objective. If he does make that decision, they'll take out air defense systems pretty quickly.
Tom, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that NATO members would need to discuss whether a cyber attack against a NATO ally would then trigger that Article 5 response from the alliance. Talk about that for a second. What might that response look like?
Yeah, this has been brewing for a very long time. In fact, one of the NATO members, Estonia, many people remember, they were attacked, a cyber attack that devastated their economy and their government systems by Russia, and they're a NATO member, and they asked NATO to consider that an act of war that would trigger the collective defense obligation under Article 5. And in fact, NATO chose not to take that action as a justification to attack further Russia. That's been a pending debate ever since. I think context here matters. So if that cyber attack causes physical harm, loss of life, and if it's done with the backdrop of this threatening buildup of military forces, I think NATO will view it differently. But there'll not be anybody arguing lightly to take any small pinprick cyber attack as a justification to get into war with Russia. It'll have to be something significant, but it certainly qualifies. And I'm glad that she said they're discussing it, because whether it's a cyber attack or a missile, if it kills people and destroys your territory or your possessions, that's grounds for defending yourself, and it's grounds for a collective defense.
President Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky again today, and after that conversation, Zelensky tweeted that they discussed strengthening sanctions, concrete defense, assistance, and an anti-war coalition. What does he mean by that, and what role could U.S. forces play in that kind of coalition?
Well, I can see a lot of U.S. force deployment to take up the backfill roles of other European forces if the Europeans start to send direct military aid into Ukraine. I think the president's been pretty clear, and at this point, even if he changed his mind, I don't know if he's got the domestic support for sending American forces directly into Ukraine. I think that what he discussed, though, on these sanctions being strong enough or weak enough is a really unfortunate sign of the stress that the Ukrainian people are under. I don't think any additional sanctions will have the immediate effect that President Zelensky is seeking, although I don't blame him for asking. We should pretty much try anything at this stage. I think instead, most of these sanctions are designed to punish Russia and to attack their operating budget so that they can't sustain this for a long period of time. That's not very satisfying to people who are in harm's way, watching their neighbors being killed. But it's not a direct defensive tool, and I think Zelensky is trying to apply it in that way.
And Tom, you're talking about the stress that Ukrainians are under. The UN says hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are on the move through the country, whether it's from the Donbas region all the way over to where I am in Poland because of this Russian invasion. They're talking about tens of thousands of them have already crossed into other countries. How is this, what is obviously going to turn into some sort of refugee crisis? How is that going to affect Europe and the U.S.?
It's going to strain everyone's ability to take care of their fellow man. We're going to see European countries having to accept a large diaspora of fleeing Ukrainians. All of us want to. American and European hearts are often larger than our breadbaskets. So I'm not afraid of the willingness of the European host countries or American host countries. But there will be an adjustment period there where you handle large inflows of people. You have to find housing and food sources adequate to take care of their needs. And remember, this is all happening in winter.